Alright YouTube, it's time for a video about North Korea because of course Kim Jong-un just had his good old Uncle Jang executed. Jang was essentially a puppet of China. Now China has used North Korea as a proxy state for decades, preventing the peninsula from being united specifically under a Western-backed group is China's main goal in the region. There's nothing really of strategic interest in North Korea. It's not a highly productive area. It has marginally good arable land. It has some mineral deposits, but nothing that China doesn't already have. And the Chinese really right now are more focused on getting fuel and steel and other things from Africa. They're focused on certain other more productive, larger Asian countries. And the continual dick fest, the sort of dick-waving, dick-size contest that it has with the Pakistanis and Indians over the disputed, largely useless mountainous region that all three of them claim. But here's my question to people who think that everything that North Korea does is still some sort of proxy move co-opted by the Chinese. If the Chinese intended North Korea to have nuclear weapons, why didn't they give them nuclear weapons? Why didn't they give them specific nuclear technology help? The answer is this. The North Koreans were used by a proxy state, as a proxy state by China, following the Korean War to prevent unification, to prevent Korea from becoming hostile to China. It would have been bad for China having a border with another country that is openly hostile. Of course, their northern border is all Russia and Mongolia, which was Soviet at the time, Soviet co-opted and communist, Vietnam, countries like that. They didn't have to worry primarily about border disputes. The only real problem was India and Pakistan. They never had to worry about Korea because they had their puppet there. What happened, though, is that China was never particularly fond of the North Koreans. You look at these Asian countries, they're all nationalistic. Most of them dislike their neighbors. Or if they don't dislike their neighbors, they at least don't particularly trust them. They're not going to partner with them, perhaps. You see the only real exception being some of the Asian countries that are solidly allied with the United States and certain European groups. Otherwise, the Asian community is constantly doing dick contests. And it's no different between the Chinese and the Koreans. The problem is this. The Koreans, when they were being helped by China, China had to help them because they didn't want an enemy right on their front door, which would be a unified Korea. It would have been dangerous. South Korea is already an advanced, fairly militarily powerful nation. A unified Korea would have been doubly as bad for the Chinese. We'd be stacking all of Eastern Asia against them. So they had to help the North Koreans. The problem is this. After the war, North Korea's technology, their surplus equipment and so forth, their manpower, their organizational skills, actually, until China had nuclear weapons, they would not have been able to fight the North Koreans off. They literally wouldn't have been able to invade without losing tens of millions of lives. So they couldn't do anything. I'm sure the Chinese would have rather simply taken North Korea over and incorporated it into a larger China. And they could have done that once they had nuclear weapons, but they still needed the North Koreans as a proxy state. Now that North Korea has nuclear weapons, it's difficult because as soon as they developed their first fissile material, China could no longer invade to change regimes, to install their puppets and so forth, without the same problem that any other arrangement would have, which is they might get attacked with nuclear weapons. It'd be fine for the Chinese, and here's the other thing, the Chinese had nuclear weapons first. What would have happened if the Chinese had nuked North Korea to take it over or install a true puppet regime, rather than the semi-proxy state arrangement they had until very recently when North Korea began developing workable nuclear weapons? It would have caused World War III. The Chinese may have been diametrically opposed to the Western world for that period up until about the 90s when they liberalized some, and now, of course, their economy's reaping the profits of that. But they weren't stupid enough to cause a nuclear war. It would have been terrible PR for them, for one thing. Even all the other Asian countries Even their marginal allies wouldn't have supported them after that. Even the Russians wouldn't have supported them. So they had no choice. They had to keep North Korea as a proxy state. The North Koreans realized this. The North Koreans realized this and moved towards weaponizing nuclear materials for that purpose. They knew that there would come a time at which their continual hammering away at the Western world, occasionally bombarding soft targets in South Korea, constantly threatening the Japanese. To tell the truth, their state propaganda, if you've ever seen it, rails against the Chinese too as traitors. They're traitors. They move towards the West. They're in bed with the imperialists from the United States. They're in bed with those terrible Russians. They don't have any love for the Chinese. The Chinese know this. The problem now is that the only way they could really control the actions of North Korea was through puppets that would be close to whoever happened to be running the country. Jang was one of these people. He was a Chinese puppet. Now he's dead. And there's some rumor going around that several of his aides fled the country in the dead of night, made it to the South Korean embassy in China, and have given over sensitive documents to both the Chinese and the South Koreans. The problem is this. If you look at North Korea, you can boil it down to two possibilities. The first possibility is that they're not really insane, that most of the banter, the rhetoric, the propaganda, the continual warmongering, kill the imperialist dogs, kill the Chinese, kill the Japanese, kill the South Koreans, and take over the whole peninsula, kill the Westerners, nuke the United States. You can assume under one circumstance that this is primarily just bunk, that it's meant mainly to delude their own people. And that the higher-ups, the military generals, they don't really buy into it, and they're not really as nationalistic as some would think. The other possibility, which is more worrying, and I think that the Chinese moving troops to the border enforces the possibility that this is true. Every time North Korea does something crazy, Chinese troops appear on the border because they're afraid of millions of defectors swarming across the border into China. The other possibility is this, that people in that country that have the ability to utilize the missiles, to send the nukes up, and so forth, really are that crazy. That they really honestly do believe that it's still the 1950s, and they're so sheltered and cut off from the rest of the world that they honestly don't understand that to any Western power, even a country like Germany or Sweden, they would be steamrolled simply by the use of higher technology. It would be qualitative warfare. None of the planes that they use would be able to get up into the sky without being blown out of it. Their nuclear weapons, as far as everyone knows, they can't even put them on missiles beyond short range because their missiles simply don't have the design capabilities to field nuclear warheads. So under one possibility, it's possible that the North Korean regime, from the military generals to the party higher-ups, really are that crazy. In which case, I would expect the Chinese will react by invading the DPRK. And here's why. I think they've lost all control of North Korea. I think they realize now that Kim truly does believe that his country has the ability to attack the South Koreans and reunite the peninsula. I think that they no longer care what the Chinese think. I think that China honestly believes, based on their own relations with the DPRK, that the DPRK really is run by people who disdain all other countries on Earth. They have grown so hyper-imperialistic, they literally might attack South Korea. You never would have dreamed this. If somebody had said Kim Jong-il is planning to attack the South Koreans, they would have said, yeah, he says that every year, though. But now they're executing Chinese puppets too. This is a game changer primarily because before, while relations with China and the DPRK weren't necessarily great, they at least would eventually listen to the Chinese. The Chinese would give them a little bit of money and aid, and here's a few missiles, go play with them, fire them off into the ocean, and everything was fine. Now they've killed the most high-ranking member who can be counted on by the Chinese to feed them information and try to feed a Chinese agenda into the DPRK. Totally different scenario. This has not happened before. You've never seen the North Koreans rattle their swords at the Chinese. I think part of it is this. If we assume that the North Korean regime and their military generals really are deluded, and really do honestly think they have the ability to invade and take over South Korea or attack and destroy the Chinese or the United States or something, if they really are that deluded, then you've got the problem whereby they might actually be dumb enough to attack China, or they think that they can defend themselves against the Chinese. The thing is this: the Chinese, if I'm head of China and I've got a proxy state that I think is actually might attempt to nuke South Korea in the form of the DPRK. If I think that's actually possible that would happen, I would scramble to invade that country and remove the regime myself. Here's why. The Chinese don't want South Korea and Japan and Taiwan and the United States and all of those groups invading instead. Because if North Korea attacks South Korea, at this point, even if they fired a single shot across the border, it would give the Western world what it wants, which is a green light to invade North Korea. It could be done very easily. The South Koreans everything within 10 to 20 miles of the DMZ would be completely crushed and flatlined. The North Koreans would advance, and there'd be very little to stop them from doing that. They would overrun the DMZ very quickly. What they wouldn't be able to do is sustain that fight for very long, because fairly soon the much more technologically advanced missiles and air force and tanks and so forth of the South Koreans would push them right back into North Korea. In the time that it would take China to mobilize enough forces to enter North Korea to prevent the entire state from being taken over and forcibly reunited by a counterattack, the South Koreans, the Japanese, and all these groups, plus our own Pacific assets, could have already nuked Pyongyang off the face of the earth, or fired a bunch of missiles into it at least, and taken over most of the good land in North Korea, which would leave China with essentially a sliver of mountain ranges, which they could claim as their own or turn into a proxy state. So the Chinese, I think, if we assume that the DPRK is run by the deluded, will invade the DPRK. I think the other thing is this. I heard another rumor where there was some sort of harebrained scheme whereby the United States would allow China to invade the country and maintain it as essentially a proxy state in return for China getting these islands off the coast of Japan that everyone's talking about. I don't know if that's true. I would have a feeling it's not. But anyway, the North Koreans, you've got to understand, the country is almost totally isolated. It's a good bet that the majority of the population actually believes that the rest of the world is falling apart and that Korea is actually the richest state. You got to understand, most people, they don't live near the DMZ. They're not looking across into South Korea and seeing all the skyscrapers there. Along the Chinese border, it's primarily mountains, so that's basically all they're seeing there. And they're a peninsula. They're this little country. They're bordered on two sides by ocean, and they're bordered by these other two states. On one side, there's a 10-mile wide wasteland of no man's land, and on the other side, it's all mountains. They might honestly believe this. They might honestly be deluded enough to think that the rest of the world is what we would look at Africa as being, the third world wasteland of corruption, poverty, and disease, whereas life in the North Korea is just somehow happy-go-lucky and perfect. They might actually believe this. The problem is we can't determine really if the generals and the higher-ups in the party believe this, because of course they make day trips to China. They've presumably, some of them have seen South Korea. That's just the way it is. So I think the Chinese, I think there's a good chance that with the death of Jang, and apparently an end to all Chinese influence in the country, really the Chinese have no reason to feed the maid. North Korea will starve. They don't have the ability to support their own population. If they undergo even a mild drought, or they have a particularly bad storm wipe out some of their arable land, people are going to start starving. You could see a coup. You could see civil war. You could see them launch some sort of suicidal attack on South Korea or China. They might actually be that desperate. And then here's the other thing. The tunnels built under the DMZ. If I had to take a guess, my guess isn't that the harebrained cartoon villain scheme of they're going to literally put tanks and people under the border into South Korea. I don't believe that's true. I think the purpose of that, the DMZ is filled with mines. It's filled with, barbed wire and mines and all sorts of other goodies. If they detonated a few nuclear weapons in those tunnels underneath the DMZ, it would presumably shift the ground and detonate all those mines and render them useless. I think the plan was more to dig those tunnels, set off these nuclear weapons, rather than literally dig all the way under the border to clear obstructions so that an overland campaign can be waged. That's something perhaps to think about. North Korea is not something to mess with when you consider how much artillery and how many, albeit older style planes that they have. They do have an enormous military force. It can't take over all of South Korea. It certainly can't wage war against a country like Japan or China. But it does have the ability to suicidally act, killing off millions of its own people and potentially millions of civilians on the other side. So this is a game changer. It is different from before. It is different from when Kim Jong-il said, launch some artillery at some islands, or fire a few rounds over the bow of this ship. That was dick wagging. The difference is they have never acted in this way towards Chinese assets. It is completely different than what we've seen from North Korea before. That's about all. Peace out.